He asked 3 times, and 3 times the answer was no. Not because God wasn't listening, not because his faith was too weak, or his prayer wasn't sincere enough, or he hadn't asked with enough conviction. This was one of the most devoted, most powerful, most faith-filled men in the entire New Testament, and he begged God to remove something painful from his life, and God's answer was simply, "It stays." If you have ever prayed desperately for something to be taken away, a struggle, a weakness, a thorn in your own life that just won't leave no matter how hard you pray, and felt confused, even hurt, by the silence or the no that followed, then this story was placed in Scripture for exactly this moment you're in. Because this isn't a story about a distant, mysterious answer from a God who doesn't explain himself. This is Paul, a man used mightily by God, who received a direct, personal response about why his suffering wasn't being removed. And that answer, once you truly understand it, is going to completely change the way you think about the struggles in your own life that God simply hasn't taken away yet. Here's why this matters. Somewhere along the way, many of us absorbed the idea that unanswered prayers for relief must mean something has gone wrong, that if we had enough faith, enough righteousness, enough spiritual maturity, God would simply remove whatever is causing us pain. And when the pain stays anyway, it can quietly plant a seed of doubt about whether God is truly good, truly listening, or truly present in our suffering at all. Paul's story exists to dismantle that assumption completely, replacing it with something far more freeing. By the time we finish walking through this together, you're going to understand not just why God sometimes allows a struggle to remain, but what that struggle might actually be producing in you that removal never could. Before we go further, I want to bring you into this moment with me. Wherever you're watching from today, carrying a struggle you've begged God to remove, a weakness you're tired of fighting, a limitation that simply will not go away no matter how much you've prayed, I want you to type one word in the comments, sufficient, just that word. Because somewhere in this story, you're going to be reminded of a truth that changed the way Paul saw his entire life, and it can change the way you see yours too. And when you scroll back through those comments, you'll see believers from all over the world quietly declaring that same truth over their own unremoved struggles. This is exactly why this channel exists, not to hand you easy explanations, but to walk with you toward the deeper truths that actually sustain faith when prayers aren't answered the way we hoped. If that kind of companionship on this journey means something to you, consider subscribing, not to grow a number, but to keep building a community of people who are learning to trust God even in what He chooses not to remove. Now let's step into Paul's own words, because the honesty in this passage is striking. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul writes about a thorn in the flesh, a phrase that has caused centuries of speculation about exactly what this struggle was. Scripture doesn't tell us precisely, and honestly, that ambiguity may be part of what makes this passage so universally relatable. It could have been a physical ailment, a recurring temptation, an ongoing opposition from enemies of his ministry. We simply aren't told. What we do know, from his own description in 2 Corinthians 12:7, is that it was a source of real, persistent, tormenting pain in his life, something he describes as a messenger sent to torment him. Lesson 1. God sometimes allows struggles to remain even in the lives of those He uses powerfully. It's worth pausing on who Paul was at this point in his life. This wasn't a new believer struggling with immaturity. This was a man who had received direct revelations from God, who had planted churches across entire regions, who had written letters that would become foundational scripture for the church for thousands of years to come. And still, this thorn remained, unresolved, painful, and persistent. This detail matters so much for anyone who has quietly assumed that the presence of an ongoing struggle in their life must mean they are somehow spiritually behind, less mature, or less used by God than someone whose life looks more resolved. Paul's story tells us plainly that this isn't how it works. Some of the most powerfully used people in Scripture carried real, unresolved pain right alongside their calling. The two were never mutually exclusive. If you have a struggle in your life right now that hasn't gone away despite your prayers, your faith, and your obedience, this does not mean you are failing somehow, or that you're less spiritually mature than someone without that particular thorn. Paul's usefulness to God and his unresolved pain existed simultaneously, and yours can too. Stop measuring your spiritual standing by whether your struggles have disappeared, and start recognizing that God can use you richly even while a thorn remains firmly in place. Lesson 2. It is not wrong to ask God directly and repeatedly for relief. Paul doesn't pretend to be at peace with this thorn from the very beginning. 2 Corinthians 12:8 tells us plainly that he pleaded with the Lord 3 times for it to be taken away from him. 3 separate, direct, honest requests for relief. This wasn't a man passively accepting suffering as though asking for help would somehow show a lack of faith. He asked again, he asked a 3rd time. This is such an important detail for anyone who feels guilty for repeatedly bringing the same painful request to God, wondering if continuing to ask reveals a lack of trust or contentment. Paul's example shows us the opposite. Persistent, honest prayer for relief is not a sign of weak faith. It's a sign of a real relationship, one where we bring our genuine desires and our genuine pain honestly before God, rather than pretending we don't feel what we feel. If you have prayed for the same relief more than once, more than a handful of times, more times than you can count, you are in good company. Paul modeled exactly this kind of honest persistence. The goal is not to stop asking. The goal is to keep bringing your thorn honestly before God, the way Paul did, trusting him with the answer, regardless of what that answer turns out to be. Lesson 3. Sometimes God's answer reveals a deeper purpose we couldn't have understood without the struggle. After Paul's 3rd request, God finally responds, and his answer is recorded in 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Not a removal of the thorn, not an explanation of exactly what it was or why it existed. Instead, a redirection entirely toward the sufficiency of grace and the way God's power actually operates most visibly through weakness rather than in spite of it. This answer must have been difficult to receive in the moment. Paul wanted removal, and what he received instead was a reframe of the entire struggle's purpose. And yet what follows in verse 9 and 10 is remarkable. Paul doesn't respond with bitterness or resignation. He writes that he will boast all the more gladly about his weaknesses so that the power of Christ may rest on him. He even says that he now delights in weaknesses, insults, hardships, and difficulties, because, in his own words, when he is weak, then he is strong. This is such a profound shift in perspective, and it offers something so valuable for anyone facing an unresolved struggle of their own. Sometimes the purpose of an unremoved thorn isn't punishment or divine oversight. It's the very thing making room for a kind of strength and dependence on God that comfort and self-sufficiency never could have produced. Paul's ministry, his writing, his entire understanding of grace was shaped profoundly by a struggle he never got relief from. Removal would have solved the pain, but it may have also removed the very thing that deepened his reliance on God's power rather than his own. If you're facing a struggle you can't seem to shake, consider that this thorn, as painful as it is, might be doing something in you that comfort never could. Not because God delights in your pain, but because our natural tendency toward self-sufficiency often only breaks down in the presence of a weakness we cannot fix ourselves. The challenge here is to bring your own thorn honestly before God, the way Paul did, and remain open to the possibility that his answer might be less about removing the struggle and more about revealing a sufficiency in himself that self-reliance would have kept you from ever fully discovering. Lesson 4. Unremoved struggles can guard us against pride in ways we may never fully see. Look closely at the reason Paul gives, earlier in this same passage, for why the thorn may have been given in the first place. 2 Corinthians 12:7 tells us it was given, at least in part, to keep him from becoming conceited because of the extraordinary revelations he had received. Paul had experienced things few people ever will: visions, direct encounters with God, a depth of spiritual insight that could easily have swelled into pride if left unchecked. This is such a sobering and honest insight into how God sometimes protects us. Not every unresolved struggle in our lives is random or purposeless. Sometimes the very thing keeping us humble, keeping us dependent, keeping us aware of our need for God, rather than confidence in our own strength or spiritual accomplishments, is the struggle we most wish would disappear. We rarely get to see this operating in real time. We usually only recognize, if ever, in hindsight, how a persistent weakness kept us tethered to genuine humility, rather than a self-assurance that could have quietly separated us from real dependence on God. This doesn't mean every struggle you face exists specifically to prevent pride, and it's important not to assign a tidy explanation to every difficulty, the way Job's friends wrongly did in his story. But it does open the possibility that some of what feels like unnecessary, unexplained suffering may actually be functioning as a quiet safeguard, protecting something in your character that you cannot fully evaluate from the inside. The practical application here is to hold your unresolved struggles with a bit more trust, even without full understanding. You may never know this side of eternity exactly what your own thorn has protected you from, but you can trust, the way Paul eventually did, that God's wisdom in allowing it to remain may be doing far more than you can currently see. Lesson 5. Weakness is the place where God's strength becomes most visible, not least visible. There's a temptation, when we're struggling, to believe that our weakness makes us less useful to God, less capable of representing Him well, less qualified to be trusted with meaningful purpose. Paul's conclusion in this passage directly confronts that assumption. In verse 9, he says he will boast all the more gladly about his weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. He isn't just tolerating his weakness, he is recognizing that it has become the very platform on which God's strength is most clearly displayed. Think about the logic here for a moment. If Paul had been entirely self-sufficient, entirely strong, entirely free of any struggle, how would anyone watching his life be able to distinguish what was Paul's own strength from what was actually God working through him? But because the thorn remained, because the weakness stayed visible, the power that carried Paul through his ministry could not be mistaken for anything other than what it truly was: God's strength operating through a genuinely weak and limited man. This offers such an important reframe for anyone who feels disqualified by their weakness rather than positioned by it. Your struggle, the thing you wish you could hide or finally overcome completely, may actually be the very place where God's power becomes most undeniably visible in your life. Not because weakness itself is good, but because it removes the confusion about where the strength is actually coming from. If you've been hiding your weakness out of shame, believing it makes you less credible or less useful, consider shifting that posture. Your honesty about your struggle, rather than a polished performance of having it all together, may be exactly what allows people around you to see God's power clearly, rather than mistaking your composure for the source of strength itself. Lesson 6. True spiritual growth often looks like deepening trust in the middle of an unresolved struggle, not the complete elimination of it. Perhaps the most important truth in this entire passage is what it teaches us about what spiritual growth actually looks like. We often measure growth by resolution, assuming that maturity means eventually overcoming every struggle, eliminating every weakness, arriving at a place where the thorns of our lives have all finally been removed. Paul's story offers a different measure of growth entirely. His maturity is not demonstrated by the thorn disappearing. It's demonstrated by how his relationship with God deepened while the thorn remained. He moved from desperately pleading for removal to genuinely delighting in weaknesses for the sake of Christ's power resting on him. That shift, from resistance to trust, from demanding relief to resting in sufficiency, is itself the growth. The thorn never changed. Paul did. This is such freeing news for anyone who has been measuring their own spiritual maturity by whether their struggles have finally gone away. Growth is not always the elimination of the thing you're fighting. Sometimes it's the deepening trust you develop while still fighting it, the increasing capacity to rest in God's grace, even while the difficulty remains fully present in your life. If your thorn hasn't gone anywhere despite years of prayer and faithfulness, this does not mean you have failed to grow. Simply mean your growth is happening in a different location than you expected, not in the removal, but in the relationship being built in the middle of what remains. There is something so steadying about walking through this entire passage from beginning to end. Paul, one of the most faithful and powerfully used men in all of Scripture, carried an unresolved, painful thorn for the rest of his ministry, and it never disqualified him, never diminished his usefulness, and never separated him from the deep, sustaining presence of God's grace. That is the invitation sitting at the center of this passage for you today. Whatever thorn you've been pleading with God to remove, the struggle, the weakness, the limitation that simply will not go away, no matter how sincerely you've prayed, you are not failing spiritually because it remains. You may, like Paul, be standing exactly where God's power is most ready to be displayed, not despite your weakness, but through it. The goal was never a life free of every thorn. The goal has always been a grace sufficient enough to carry you through the ones that stay. His grace was enough for Paul in his weakest place, and it is enough for you in yours too. If this encouraged you today, I'd love for you to like this video, and if stories like this speak to where you are, consider subscribing so we can keep walking through Scripture together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.